Norwegian is the main language spoken in Norway. Called norsk in Norwegian, there are many different types of the Norwegian language that are spoken there, and one type is called Kebabnorsk, or translating in English to Kebab Norwegian, a type of Norwegian that I came into contact with when I lived there last year during my time in Oslo. But what is Kebabnorsk? Can you eat it? Can you speak it? Where does it come from? Well, let's find out more. The term Kebabnorsk, as you can probably guess, is a mixture of the word kebab and the word Norwegian, and it's actually borrowed from a similar term from Swedish, kebab svensk, which means kebab Swedish. This was the name that was given to a variety of the Swedish language that started to be spoken in the 1990s in certain urban areas in Sweden, named of course after the kebab, a famous dish from the Middle East, because many of the immigrants coming to these Swedish cities were from the Middle East, and so the variety of Swedish that they spoke, often influenced by several other languages, was being referred to as kebab Swedish. Much the same is true for Kebabnorsk, except it's a common misconception that this variety of Norwegian arose simply from immigrants not learning to speak Norwegian properly, as will be demonstrated, because it isn't the case that this Norwegian variety is the result of speakers of one language, for example Arabic, learning to speak Norwegian and then importing their own features from Arabic into Norwegian, a process called interference. So for example, if you have someone who speaks Spanish as a first language learning to speak English, they may insert an E before many words that start with an S. So for example, sports may become esports and things like this. However, the case with Kebabnorsk is rather more complicated because there are many host languages that have influenced Kebabnorsk, as well as Norwegian, of course, being the base. These include, but aren't limited to, Kurdish, Polish, Turkish, Chilean Spanish, Swedish, Arabic, Urdu, and Pashto, as well as several others. One important factor to mention too is that while the majority of immigrants aren't first language English speakers, many English words have also entered the lexicon as a result of popular media, particularly hip-hop, film, and as a result of general slang being used throughout Norway. However, Kebabnorsk and Norwegian slang are not quite the same, as we will get into in this video. For this reason, linguists prefer to use the term Norwegian multiethnolect. A multiethnolect, then, is simply the term that is given to a linguistic style and/or variety that is part of linguistic practices of speakers of more than two different ethnic and, by consequence, linguistic backgrounds, and contains an unusually high number of features from more than one language, but has one clear base language, generally the dominant language of the society where the multi-ethnolect is in use. This definition fits very well what we see with Kebabnorsk, where the main communities where it is spoken are first language speakers of several different languages, including of Norwegian, but it is still clearly identifiable as a form of Norwegian, rather than being something more like a Creole or a Pidgin language, for example. So in practice, what this means is that even though person A may speak as a first language or be within a household from Iraq where they speak Arabic, and person B may be from a household from Pakistan where they speak Urdu or Pashto as a first language, when they come together, they are still able to understand one another when they speak Kebabnorsk, even though one cannot understand the other's first language. It therefore forms a kind of solidifying bond between these immigrant communities of various linguistic backgrounds, which have been influenced by several. But to understand one word that appears in Kebabnorsk, one does not have to understand the entire language that another person has as a background. And so this is a rather modern form of language creation, of dialect creation that we see in these very highly diverse urban environments where there are many, many different linguistic backgrounds at play. If we take a look at a few example words of the special lexical items that we find in Kebabnorsk, of which there are quite a few, we can see that there are several different linguistic features that have come into the language. So for example, for the verb to see or ser in modern Norwegian, we have sjåfør, which is from Arabic. The word flus is being used for money. Kabe seems to be quite a well-known one, even by speakers that aren't necessarily speakers of Kebabnorsk but have heard this word. I believe in its original form in Arabic or Berber that it had the meaning of a prostitute, a whore, and was quite derogatory. But I think now in Kebabnorsk it no longer is particularly derogatory and is just used for women or for girls in general. But interesting how that has developed over time. The word spa is a word that I came across when I was in Oslo, used quite a bit, especially or even by people that didn't have any kind of migration background, and this simply means good or cool in a way. And we can also see some words that maybe are surprising. So, for example, the word brorsan, which is from Swedish for brother, which is quite different to the standard Norwegian bror. Another example might be å digga, which means to dig something, to find something cool, which appears to have come through Swedish into Kebabnorsk as well. Apart from the vocabulary, which is of course a very recognizable feature, it isn't just that we have slang terms. What makes this a language variety or a multi-ethnolect are some of the syntactical and grammatical differences that we see among speakers of this language. First of all, though, it's crucial to recognize too that we have several compound words being formed from various languages, showing that this isn't simply bad Norwegian, but rather people that are playing with language and creating new forms of words by combining several linguistic sources to create new words. One is drittspa, which means something along the lines of very cool. Dritt in Norwegian actually means shit. It's not a good word, but combining it with spa, this Berber word originally that means cool, it means like shit cool or really cool. So we see the word shit, the Norwegian word, being used as an intensifier to make something much more, as we use a lot of curse words in English as well. In my own dialect, I would use the word dead for this. If something's dead good, then it's very good, even though dead by itself isn't necessarily a good thing. Interesting too is the word wallah, which is used quite a lot. This is clearly derived from Arabic and from the name of the Lord, but it has several different functions grammatically in Kebabnorsk. So it can be used as an intensifier, so the same way that we saw dritt being used. So if something is very something, it can be wallah something else. It can also be a self-referential term, that people who speak the language are people who speak wallah. And indeed, it is also a name for the sociolect itself. So wallah språk would be wallah language. And there's even a term wallah wannabe for people who try and speak this Kebabnorsk but are not very successful at it. It can also be used as a question marker, so like using the English word really, question mark. And what's interesting is that it can also be used as a statement of affirmation or confirmation. So if you ask really, wallah, question mark, you can reply with wallah, which means yes, really. So an interesting word that has a lot of different functions that we don't see in the original Arabic, but that we do now see in Kebabnorsk. Writing on several different multi-ethnolects that are appearing in urban European centres, J. Cheshire et al. Notes, as these few examples make clear, many of the words taken from other languages are evaluative adjectives, intensifiers, or fixed phrases with interpersonal ritual functions in discourse. Some are taboo or slang words. Since multi-ethnolects have their origins in young people's informal, spontaneous discourse, it's not surprising that these words of this kind, for example, adolescents, are known to use a higher proportion of intensifiers than other age groups, and that they are thought to have an iconic status as markers of multi-ethnolectal speech. No doubt their iconic status contributes to their use in styling and in a range of young people's social practices. Some of the interesting semantic features can be found in Kebabnorsk. For example, if we take a look at the V2 word order that we can find in English. So if we compare English and Norwegian, most of the time both use SVO word order, subject, verb, object. So here we have Ola. So for example, the English sentence, Olaf reads a book during his lunch break, we can see that the word order is almost identical in Standard Norwegian. Olaf leser ei bok I lunsjpausen sin, with the only exception being that the lunch pause and his are switched around. However, if we take the V2 word order, where the verb takes the second place, we can see that there is a difference between English and Standard Norwegian. Whereas in English, we would have, during his lunch break, Olaf reads a book. In Norwegian, it would be I lunsjpausen sin leser Olaf ei bok. So we can see that the one doing the action, Olaf, and the verb leser or reads have been switched around. However, in Kebabnorsk, it does not follow the standard Norwegian pattern, and there is a lot more freedom to follow the English pattern, where the subject comes before the verb, and the verb is in second position. In a similar way, speakers of Kebabnorsk are also freer in their use of the word ikke, which is the Norwegian word for not. Now, most of the time in Norwegian, this word will come after the verb. This is rather interesting. Now, what we can see here, for example, is that the standard Norwegian phrase of Jeg snakker ikke kebabnorsk, I speak not kebabnorsk, to use the words in the same order. Kebabnorsk, we would find Jeg ikke kjetter kebabnorsk. So obviously kjetter is a borrowing from English into kebabnorsk, but otherwise Jeg ikke snakker kebabnorsk. I don't speak kebabnorsk. This is a similar thing we see with the word på, which is a preposition meaning on. And this is actually, interestingly enough, a mistake that I made a lot of the time and still do with Norwegian, that I overuse the preposition på when I should be using other prepositions like in, so in, or i, which is in other situations, or third, things like this. I would use på a lot more, which means on and can only be used in certain circumstances. For example, how you get on a plane, but you're on the train. Well, you might be in the classroom rather than on the classroom. It means something else in English, similarly in Norwegian. It seems, however, that with Kebabnorsk speakers, they also overuse this på, which I thought was rather interesting given my own experience, that I defaulted to på because it seemed to be the right choice of preposition, even when Norwegians would actually correct me and say, no, you need to use in for this example. Or til, which is another one that you find very frequently. In Standard Norwegian, there are 3 genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Now, what these do is a little bit different to as we find gender in, say, the Romance languages like French, Spanish, Italian. But what we find is that they influence the article that comes before. So if you have a car, because car in Norwegian is masculine, it's en bil. Whereas an apple is neuter, and therefore it's et eple and not en eple, because it's not got the same gender. So it's a little bit different to how we find these words in English. But in Norwegian, these 3 different genders influence the article that we see. And indeed, the definite article, so the difference between saying a car and the car in Norwegian, is that a car is en bil, and to say the car, it's bilen. So we stick it on the end instead of at the front of the word, similar to how it was in Old Norse. But long story short, what differentiates Kebabnorsk from Standard Norwegian is that Kebabnorsk favors the masculine gender a lot more. So they overuse these forms even when technically speaking the word is feminine or neuter. So they may say en hytta or en avis or en tre rather than the what would really be correct avis or et tre. Note, however, though, that there is a distinction here between the 2 written forms of Norwegian, that the bokmål variant is less stringent between these 3 different genders than nynorsk, which is a lot more stringent about which forms you use, particularly in terms of the feminine and the neuter forms. So there is some distinction between various dialects and indeed the 2 standard forms of written Norwegian about these genders. But Kebabnorsk favors the masculine gender, which is overused as opposed to the other 2. So this leads on to an interesting point about Kebabnorsk, is that historically it has been seen as wrong Norwegian or bad Norwegian, Norwegian that has been learned improperly, and that people who speak Kebabnorsk, often immigrants or people of immigrant background, are incapable of speaking proper Norwegian, and so they speak this Kebabnorsk, which is just bad Norwegian. While there is some truth to this, because this is a multiethnolect that has developed from people going from various L1s to L2 Norwegian. And some of these processes are simplifications, as we've seen the immense array of vocabulary that has come in and different grammatical, syntactical practices that we see aren't necessarily simpler than Standard Norwegian. They're just different to Standard Norwegian. This is something that I mentioned in a very different context in my video about the Geordie dialect, which is the dialect that I had most contact with growing up. And I've noticed some similar things with the discussion about Kebabnorsk in Norwegian and Geordie and other dialects around the world that we might see. So Geordie for a long time was considered wrong English. Indeed, when I was at school, this would often be said by various teachers when children did speak in dialect rather than in standard English. But just because dialect speakers might have different forms in dialect doesn't mean that they are incapable of producing the forms in the standard variety of the language. So for example, if we take a look at Geordie, there are a few different irregular verb forms that deviate from standard English. So instead of I told, I stole, you would have I telt, I stelt. What we also find throughout Geordie is a propensity to use the same form for the preterite and the past participle. So instead of I see, I saw, I have seen, it would be I see, I seen, I've seen. Or I gan, I went, I've went, which isn't correct standard English, but it's fine to do so in Geordie. However, just because when I'm with my friends in the Northeast, I'll use these forms on the right, doesn't mean that when I'm speaking standard English, so for example in a video, that I can't say I've told you about Kebabnorsk. People have stolen the identity of the kebab to name this language. I have gone to Oslo last year. Or I went to Oslo last year. It doesn't mean that I'm incapable of using these forms. It just means that I have an alternate set that I use in certain circumstances with certain people. And this process is called code switching, where you speak a certain way with a certain group of people. And everyone does this, whether it's across dialect or simply with different groups of people. For example, you probably wouldn't speak to your boss the same way that you talk to your child or to a close friend or to a parent. These are simple examples of code switching. And similar things are true for Kebabnorsk, where in the past people have thought this is particularly bad Norwegian. Most Kebabnorsk speakers now, especially those born in Norway and taken through the Norwegian schooling system, are fully capable of speaking Standard Norwegian, as well as speaking this dialect form when they are with other people who speak. What's interesting to note is that while this dialect was first identified around 1990, now that we're over or coming on 35 years later, we can see how this dialect has changed and developed. Many of the original words that were being used are no longer in fashion, and new words come in, sometimes being replaced just years or even months after they were introduced. And so it continues to devolve and to develop as time goes on. What's also interesting to note is that while this started off very much as an immigrant dialect, now there are even ethnic Norwegians who don't have an immigrant background who are speaking this way because of living in the same areas, particularly in the east of Oslo, where many immigrants are. This therefore shows that this is also partly a choice to speak a certain way and to belong to a certain group as part of identity. Speaking Kebabnorsk with immigrants of various backgrounds and indeed with various ethnic Norwegians, as this has become something of an identity for particular areas and to bring across a particular message. It's even made its way out of eastern Oslo and other urban centres where people live in close proximity with immigrants, even to those Norwegians of higher class, let's say, who don't come into contact with immigrants who speak Kebabnorsk very often, through hip-hop and other media, such as TV programmes like Gangs of Oslo, 17 and 18, which are various seasons, and mostly through music. And so some of these words like kebe and spar and schmo and others are being used quite regularly by people that are actually not from these areas at all. And then it's interesting to see how these eventually get subsumed into Standard Norwegian as well. So, what do you think about Kebabnorsk? Snakker du norsk? Er du norsk? Snakker du Kebabnorsk? Skriv meg I kommentar der ned, og jeg skal lese hva du ser in my absolutely worst Norwegian. But let me know what you thought about this video and about this dialect. A lot of people watched the video about the Geordie dialect. Of course, I'm from the Northeast, that's where I grew up. I lived in Gateshead for a year when I just made that video, and I've now just come back from a year living in Oslo, so I thought I'd make a video about one of the forms that is spoken there. Now, of course, Oslo also has the Oslo dialect that is, let's say, the traditional dialect from Oslo. It's very closely entwined with bokmål, with this standardized Norwegian writing system, and it's been heavily influenced by Danish, which is rather interesting. So if you're interested in that, then I can make a video on it. I'm planning to do a video about bokmål and nynorsk and the whole history and the Norwegian language war. But if there's anything else you'd like me to make a video on, I was thinking of maybe doing one on some other multi-ethnolects that are around Europe and whether these will turn into some kind of modern Yiddish. Obviously a variety, rather different because Yiddish was from people with Jewish background, whereas this is from people with a lot of different ethnic backgrounds. But perhaps we're seeing some similar things because there are some similar words that we find in various Swedish, so kebab, svensk, that we find in, I think it's called Kanaka, Deutsch, so sort of Turkish and Moroccan, German, that we find in Berlin, and then straattaal in the Randstad in the Netherlands. Some very similar words that are found throughout all of these. So maybe interesting to make a video zoomed out looking at a lot of these different immigrant multi-ethnolects. But let me know in the comments below. Thank you all very much for watching. I have been Hilbert, and I will see you all later. Vi snakkes.